Very much, Peter, and thanks, David, for that terrific opening salvo on this topic. I've just been doing some reflection, and I recently officially retired, although I'm still doing a lot of work for the university in an honorary capacity. And I was looking back and I realised that for the last 39 years I've been working on how to develop an ecologically sustainable electricity system, one which is clean, reliable and affordable. 100% renewable electricity for Australia, which has been my main interest over all those years. And progress has been enormous. Now, I'm not a political scientist, but so I come at it as a physical scientist who often works with electrical engineers, who is currently working with many electrical engineers on this fundamental problem. And as David has said, South Australia is a fantastic case study because it is the Australian state that has the most of the variable renewable energy in this country. To be fair, we should mention Tasmania because it often gets forgotten and drops off the bottom of the map. Tasmania is almost 100% renewable electricity, but most of that is actually hydro, and hydro is less variable from day to day, from week to week, than wind or solar photovoltaics, because hydro is backed up by water stored in big dams. So most of the time Tasmania has a very reliable system, mostly hydro, supplemented with some wind, and also sadly a transmission line that runs under the Bass Strait, which recently broke down, and unfortunately at the time when there'd been a long drought in South Australia. And so the response of those who deny renewable energy was to say, well, you see, even in Tasmania you can't rely on renewable energy, even with hydro. Tasmania should go and become much more fossil fuel. And of course it was receiving fossil fuel from Victoria, brown coal-fired electricity, the most polluting form, occasionally across that transmission line before it broke. But there's another answer, of course, and that answer is, well, Tasmania would have done much better after that transmission line broke during the drought if it had built far more wind power, because wind and hydro are a fantastic combination, and you don't simultaneously get a drought of hydro and a drought of wind. That would be incredibly rare. Okay, so now in Tasmania they're thinking, should we build another transmission line from brown coal in Victoria or what? And they're really not talking much about more wind. Now we come to South Australia. Last year, wind power provided 42% of annual electricity generation in South Australia. Gas still provided a bit more, and in third place there is an interconnector between South Australia and Victoria, two transmission lines which link South Australia to the rest of the so-called national electricity market. But it's a weak link. You can't put a lot of power across between the two states. And so the scene in South Australia, then, the landscape is predominantly gas, followed by a lot of wind, a little bit of interconnector, and a year ago there were two coal-fired power stations. But those stations have been shut down because they couldn't compete with wind, basically. Coal is dead in South Australia, and this is one of the reasons why those who hate renewable energy are so angry and are so hostile. Wind has wiped out coal in South Australia, and it will shortly wipe out what we call baseload gas. Now baseload, sorry I have to give you some terminology. A baseload station is one that is designed to run 24/7 at full power. It provides the base of the power. In Australia, all base essentially, almost all base is coal. In France, it is nuclear. but in Australia it's coal. And these baseload stations are not flexible in operation. You can't start them. They might take a day or more to start up from coal. You can't ramp them up and down to follow the peaks in demand. And the peaks in demand are part of the issue that we're going to come to in a moment. South Australia is different from the other mainland states in it actually has a baseload gas-fired station. And that station is likely to have to shut down too, because gas is expensive as a fuel and it's an old station, and it too is not competing with wind. Okay, so let's have a look at what happened in South Australia. And like David, I'd like to talk about two events. The recent event a few days ago, which took place in the peak of the heat wave. It started about 6 p.m. on the hottest day. So at 6 p.m, South Australia, I forgot to mention, has quite a lot of rooftop solar power as well. And that comes in at number 4 after the interconnector. About 7% of South Australia's electricity comes from residential solar. But at 6 p.m, that solar had almost died away. The sun was setting. And at the same time, the heat wave was actually reaching its peak of heat. So people turned their air conditioners on. It was the peak in electricity demand, and wind does come into it a little bit. Unfortunately, it was so hot and also so still, so there wasn't much wind generation going on at that time. And so what happened was that the operator of the market, the regulator, instructed the South Australian distributor to create rolling blackouts for short periods. In other words, blackouts in some areas, maybe for half an hour there, half an hour here. And that was the most painless form. And incidentally, the South Australian operator misinterpreted the instructions and blacked out far more than had been required. And as David has said, even though there wasn't much wind going, there was plenty of gas-fired power in reserve that wasn't operating at the time. And there were a number of different reasons for that, some of which may well have been the gas-fired power stations gaming the market, playing games to try and maximise their profits. More information will come out about that. Excuse me. So who's to blame? Do we blame wind? Because the wind had dropped away, it's true. Do we blame the Australian energy market operator because they were a bit slack in giving instructions about preparing to fill the gap that was provided in that really high peak in demand? Or do we blame the gas-fired generators? You can see it's quite complicated. And of course, the government used that opportunity, the coalition government used that opportunity in Canberra to attack wind, as they had done previously during the blackout last September. But in their attacks and in their lies, one has to say they're not total lies. The cleverest lies are based on half-truths, although in this case I would call them 10% truths. So there was a small element of truth there. Wind power wasn't generating much at all at that time. But there's lots of other factors, and there was no need for the blackouts if the gas had come on as required. However, we have to keep in mind that it's likely that the baseload gas station will retire in the next couple of years, and we do have an issue in South Australia in planning for the future. So there's a small element of agreement there with the coalition government that we do have to do some planning for the future. The government's conclusion is that in planning, the best plan is to stop the growth of renewable energy. Needless to say, I disagree with that. In fact, on the basis of our research at the University of New South Wales, I would say that South Australia could be the first state to run on 100% renewable electricity. But it can't do it if it keeps building new wind farms and new solar farms, unless it does other things as well. You've got to have a planned strategy, because wind and solar photovoltaics are variable. So there's the 10% truth again. But the 100% truth is we can do it if we plan it right, and I'll try and explain how to do that. But first, I suppose I have to go back to last September to the black day in which the whole state was blacked out. And David's already described that, so I won't describe it in detail, but I'll just add a bit more detail to try and explain what happened. So, as David said, there was wind caused the blackout, but it wasn't the wind farms, it was the windstorm. There were tornadoes that knocked down 23 transmission towers, destroyed 3, possibly 4 of the main transmission lines in South Australia, and caused a partial blackout of the state. There's no doubt about that. It's perfectly clear. The debate about is really what blacked out the rest of the state. And there was a role for wind in there, but again, it's a complicated scene of confusion from different players in the game. Wind farms have the ability to so-called ride through faults in the system. So we had a partial blackout. What happens then, pardon the technical side, is that there's a sudden drop in the voltage, in the pressure of the electricity going through the wires. There's a sudden drop in that pressure, which is called the voltage, and that's called a fault. And wind farms have the capacity to keep generating through a series of faults, but they are adjusted with settings to basically stop them continuing to generate if there are too many faults that could damage the wind turbines. And those settings in some of the wind turbines had been adjusted to be too sensitive, and they dropped out. Not all wind farms dropped off, but some did because of the settings. And the Australian Energy Market Operator claims it didn't know about these settings, which is very hard to believe, because they are the operator of the whole national electricity market. So what happened was, when a large part of the grid dropped out, was that eventually some of the wind farms dropped out too, and that meant that all the pressure was devoted onto the interconnector from Victoria, and it couldn't cope with the increased demand to fill the gap between supply and demand, so it shut down, and then the whole state shut down. So wind played a modest role in there, but it wasn't an essential role, in the sense that the settings could have been adjusted to survive that event, and in fact now they have been adjusted. And the operator is saying that event won't happen again in the foreseeable future. So again, it's complex, and the government took advantage of the fact that wind was involved to blame wind for the whole system. Okay, so now the question is, how can we actually develop this, or how can South Australia develop a strategy? How can Australia develop a strategy to go to 100% renewable electricity? And I say with confidence that we can do this, because at UNSW we've been running hour by hour computer simulations for the last 6 years on 100% renewable electricity for the national electricity market. So on a computer model of the whole system, we've been running hour by hour using real data on sun and wind and electricity demand every hour for 6 years. And we have shown that in fact we could run the whole system on 100% renewables, but we have to do some planning to make that transition to the system. You can't just build more and more wind farms and more solar farms without doing other things as well. So the challenge is to have 100% renewables with a system that's just as reliable as the existing system, the existing dirty system in Australia, which is 3/4 coal, where renewables are only about 15% in Australia as a whole, although they're 42% in South Australia last year. So the key problem for reliability is meeting these peaks that David talked about, peaks in demand for electricity, particularly on a hot summer evening. At the end of the day, everyone turns on their air conditioners, demand goes up like that, and sometimes, well, the solar energy is fading away because there isn't yet significant storage in the system, and sometimes, occasionally, there isn't that much wind. How do you handle those rare peaks? Well, the first thing to say is the last thing you would do to handle such a peak is to install a baseload power station like coal or nuclear, because they cannot be operated flexibly enough to meet those peak demands. You can't turn them on and off quickly. It takes about a day to get them up to full power. They are hopeless. They are the worst possible partner for variable renewable energy. So they're much too inflexible, and of course, in addition, they're incredibly expensive now. Renewables are cheaper, at least wind and solar PV are. They're hazardous, and they are very slow to build. You're talking about 5 to 6 years for planning and building a coal-fired station, and probably 15 years to plan and build Australia's first nuclear if such a disaster ever happens. So what we need is short-term solutions which are technically feasible, affordable and fast. Okay, and I've listed here, as I was on the train, about 6 different options. And some of them can be brought on really quickly, and some of them take a few years to bring on. So I'll first get rid of the conventional option. And there is a conventional option. It's not baseload coal or gas or nuclear, but it's called a gas turbine. And before you shudder, let me explain what this means. It's basically a jet engine. And yes, officially they take about 20 minutes instead of a day to go from coal to full power, but in fact some jet engines can go to full power in 10 minutes, the aeroderivative gas turbines. And they basically are a fantastic technology because they don't only burn fossil fuels. You can burn renewable gases and liquids in a gas turbine. You can burn biofuels. You can burn hydrogen produced from renewable energy. You can burn ammonia. All of these things can be burned in a gas turbine. They are a terrific technology. They are commercial, they are mass produced, and they are cheap. Now, of course, if you fly on gas turbines from Sydney to London, they're not cheap at all. They're running for what, 24 hours or 21 hours or whatever for your flight. But in our simulations we found there are only a few periods during summer and winter when you actually need to turn them on. So they have low capital cost and they're only run infrequently for 2 to 3 hours during these peak periods. So they have low fuel costs. So basically they are reliability insurance with a low premium. So at present they are, in my view, the cheapest and fastest way of ensuring that we can meet those peaks. They're a temporary measure, right? In the longer term they can be replaced with batteries. But right now batteries are very expensive, and however over the next 5 to 10 years batteries will become, and already becoming, considerably cheaper. So open cycle gas turbines are cheap reliability insurance, and the South Australian government, if it's worried about next summer, and it should be worried because there are new wind farms and solar farms coming online, and there are limits to how much of this variable renewable energy you put on without balancing it with other sources. So initially gas turbines may be fueled on gas but hardly using any gas, but then followed up with other sources that replace the gas turbines like batteries. And we are just at the beginning of a situation where people with solar photovoltaics on their roofs are starting in a small way to put in batteries. So that means that if you're out at work all day and your solar panels are generating power, it's not terribly helpful. But if you have batteries, you can absorb that solar energy, and then in the evening when you come home, you turn on your air conditioner and your cooker and lights and everything, you draw from the batteries. And that dramatically reduces the size of the peak demand on the grid. And if you are rewarded by a grid electricity price that increases during periods of peak demand, you save a fortune, potentially. Unfortunately, the South Australian government has so far been reluctant to move in that way, but inevitably they will. Never mind, this thing will keep collapsing. Okay, so batteries are another option. They're not quite ready yet, and temporarily gas turbines can fill the gap. Now, there's another technology that can play an enormous role within probably 5 years, 3 to 5 years or so, which is another form of solar energy called concentrated solar thermal power. So you have a lot of mirrors which produce focus an enormous amount of heat on a particular point, which can boil water and produce steam to turn turbines and generate electricity. But the beauty of this technology is that some of the excess heat you generate on a summer day can be stored in tanks of molten salt, and then they can generate on demand when you want them. In other words, concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage can be what we call dispatchable power, able to dispatch electricity into the grid when wanted. Now, this is a commercial technology, but because it hasn't yet been mass-produced around the world on a huge scale, it's still quite expensive. But I would certainly recommend that South Australia build its first concentrated solar thermal power station. There is a plan that has been created by a group called Beyond Zero Emissions plus local Port Augusta groups for a 110 megawatt power station at Port Augusta in South Australia, and that should be done too. But there is a funding gap because it is still very expensive technology. It would need to be funded by the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So far those agencies have survived the attacks of actually both federal governments, both Labor and Coalition, who've taken funding away from them. So that's another feasible option. Now, a bit slower approach is not to generate new power at all, but to reduce the demand at critical times, to cut down unnecessary demand. And it is possible, if with modern technology, to have switches that you put into certain circuits, like your air conditioner circuit or your refrigerator circuit, and if you sign the appropriate contract with the electricity supplier, you could agree that they can switch off your fridge for half an hour or your air conditioner for half an hour. It's not going to destroy the food in your fridge for such a short period, or it's not going to heat up your house too much. And they can roll that, each half hour they can roll that across the community. Now, in fact, that's not a very radical solution because it's already being done for aluminium smelters. Aluminium smelters are being switched off for up to an hour at a time without damaging the smelting process. And in fact, this happened last week in New South Wales during the heat wave. And an aluminium smelter was switched off. Now, of course, aluminium smelters pay almost nothing for their electricity, so they do pretty well out of this agreement that occasionally they can be switched off. They can be offloaded for short periods. So all I'm suggesting is that the idea of offloading can be properly planned, and with modern smart switches, they can be controlled both by us, the customers, and also by the electricity utility. If we sign a contract to reduce our electricity bills for agreeing that we can be offloaded, parts of our system can be offloaded for half an hour at a time.
Just a few minutes now.
Okay, so that's entirely feasible and is going to happen, but it needs to be accelerated, and it needs again the right policies to drive it forward. Now, South Australia also has the potential for hydroelectric storage. Now, you might be a bit surprised by this because it has no fast rushing rivers going down mountains, but it has got hills near the coastline in the Gulfs. So the idea is to pump seawater using excess wind power and solar power when there's a lot of excess power that would otherwise be lost, using that to pump the water up into small reservoirs in the hills near the coast, and then when there is a peak in demand, running the water back down through turbines to generate electricity. And in fact, there is a grant from ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, to my former student, Professor Andrew Blakers at the ANU, to actually investigate this. Finally, there is the possibility of joining South Australia to New South Wales directly. And that would be very expensive, but in the long term, it would make the whole national electricity market more stable. Okay, so let me wrap up. So far, I've left the federal government out of this, but of course we also, because I feel that the present federal government, and in fact the alternative federal government, has almost given up on renewable energy. We just saw an announcement yesterday, I think it was, that Labor seems to be backing out of the renewable energy target between 2020 and 2030, putting all their hope on a scheme called an emissions intensity scheme, which could be set up to push renewable energy through, but almost certainly will be set up to push more gas into the system and delay renewable energy. So we would like some federal government policies, but perhaps we won't get them for some time. We would like an expansion of the renewable energy target, which has been one of the main drivers of renewable energy in this country, between 2020 and 2030, and perhaps a special target for concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage to get that established. We would like a national carbon price, but I would vote any time for a carbon tax because it's the hardest to cheat on. We need to change the rules and the objective of the national electricity market to make energy efficiency and renewables more easy to disseminate. And so there's a whole range of things that need to be done at the federal level, but right now I think our main hope is that the states and the territories like the ACT will continue their moves to develop renewable energy and ignore the request of the federal government to hand their programs over to the federal government, because that would be a recipe for the end of growth in most renewable energy, certainly in large-scale renewable energy in Australia. So thanks very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much to our two speakers. It's been a very solid presentation from both of them. We're going to have a break for just 10 minutes. We've had long presentations, so get a drink. While we're doing that, we'll go around with the collection to help pay for the production of our program and for the recordings, which we hope we can continue with the actual video camera soon. The pink program's got our website on it, and we're asking you to really help us on the social media side by using the website and using the Facebook page. So thank you very much. See you in 10 minutes.
Yeah.